to Tiny House Fest Vermont. First year. Woo! I'm Erin Miley O'Keefe, and this is Lisa Kuhneman, and we also have another cohort, Betsy Hall, who's around. And I guess it was maybe 5 months ago, we said, I was holding little tiny house talks in my house, and Betsy said, we should do a festival. And I was like, I don't know, I'm building a tiny house this year. That's like, seems kind of crazy. And then she said it again. And then the third time she said it, I was like, okay, let's do it. And here we are. So thanks for turning out. Lisa wanted me to remind you about is on the Indiegogo site, we're crowdfunding this festival. A house that myself and many generous hands, including my husband, in the last 6 days, we built the paper boat house, which is the SIP house over there. And that's going to be done this fall. And if you want to stay in it in May of next year, you can go on the Indiegogo site. You know more about that. You want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. There are one-night opportunities and two-night opportunities to stay in Miley House. There are some images that if you haven't already gone over, and I think they're posted over there as well, you can take a look at what the finished house is going to look like. I don't think you've seen anything else out there like it. If you've seen a lot of tiny houses, this one's definitely unique. So, it's a great opportunity because once Erin and Kevin move in, I think that opportunity will be gone. So, thanks for coming and making it what it is.
So, and like Lisa said, this festival is really about integrating into downtown Brattleboro. So we're really encouraging also the restaurants throughout Brattleboro have Tiny Bites menus, which is why we don't have food vendors here. So please, if you're not from Brattleboro or you are from Brattleboro, take a walk through the town and support our local businesses.
That's part of what makes it great. We do have sponsors that are helping. Being the first year, anything that starts up the first time, people want to see a track record, and then they get on board. So we do have a few brave sponsors I'd like to mention. Manny's TV and Appliance has been very generous. We really, not only with financial support, but just a fantastic online cheerleading campaign. So we appreciate that very much. We have sponsorship from Chroma Tech up in Bellows Falls and from Recycle Away. They have containers for recycling. Usually see them in public places and schools, public buildings. And they're centered right here in Brattleboro. We have a list of partners, local partners, that is, every time I look at it, I can't believe it. Really want to shout out to the Latches Hotel. Their support has been incredible. They knew what we were after when we said we wanted to be in this space. They understood what we were trying to do in the way of imagining how our spaces could be used. And they got on board and were very supportive.
Hello, everybody. Oops. My name is Rod Francis. I'm the planning director of the Town of Brattleboro, and we just wound up a session here talking about housing need and changing expectations of housing in the last session. And I'm going to stay on and talk more in a more focused way just about the zoning questions. So this is specific to Brattleboro. I'd say the application is pretty broadly the same for anywhere else in Vermont, but there'll be some particular details that will vary. And if you're from Massachusetts, no, don't forget it. But MJ's still here, so you got issues, but we can deal with that. So, all right. So I think I made it clear the first time I was talking that there's basically two different routes for, or two different ways of thinking about a tiny house. So most of the tiny houses we see here today are trailer-based, which is good from the standpoint of construction and certainly good from the standpoint of moving them around. So we would view a tiny house on a trailer with wheels as an RV. Now, I want to make a weird but important distinction right at the beginning. For us, an RV is not a mobile home, and a mobile home is not an RV, okay? So there's a whole set of regulations about conventional mobile homes, the sorts that you might find in a mobile home park or in rural communities all over the country. And we've got slang terms for them like trailer or double wide or a bunch of things like that. We're not talking about those at all here, okay? We have a set of regulations that govern those structures, and we definitely regard them as structures. And if you think about it for a little while, most of them, after not too long, become modified in a way that means that they're not really mobile anymore. They're mobile to deliver them and get them to the site, but they're not ever going to really leave, in one piece at least, okay? So, partly because people usually put a gable roof on them for the snow, and then they don't go onto bridges anymore. So that's kind of the end of it. So, back to the topic. You can have an RV, it can be a tiny house. We will always insist that it's insured, registered, inspected, and ready to be towed at any time, because you might have to. Certainly if you're in the floodplain or the floodway, which would be an extremely dangerous place to put it, but okay, just for the sake of argument, it's definitely going to have to be maintained at all times, because if there's anything like a flood event that's predicted, we would require you to remove it, partly because of your own safety, partly because we don't want to actually risk the lives of emergency service workers coming to get you if you don't move it. And then thirdly, and just as importantly, whether you're in it or not and it floats away, it's going to plug something up and make the flooding worse, and that's really going to upset us. So basically, floodplain and floodway and a tiny house is a very bad combination, and we'd only suffer under very specific circumstances. So the other way, what you might describe as the more urban setting, is what we call an accessory dwelling unit. Now here, in normal zoning terminology, an accessory dwelling unit is not just a tiny house. An accessory dwelling unit could be a converted garden shed or a chicken coop. We've done several of those, usually after they've been cleaned. It could be a wheel pad, it could be the upstairs of a barn, it could be an attic, it could be a bunch of different things. So when we're talking about an accessory dwelling unit, we're talking about an addition to a property, or the conversion of one use, say a garage or a barn, into a dwelling unit. There are certain things that we look for and require. We require that it be what we refer to as a self-contained dwelling unit, which means that it has kitchen facilities and bathroom facilities, absolutely a toilet, a functioning toilet, and that it meets other basic requirements to be permitted. So in other words, it meets our health and safety needs with regard to somewhere to live and sleep. If it doesn't have a kitchen and it doesn't have a bathroom, then it's not a dwelling unit by definition. So if we were then to discover subsequently that you were renting this tiny house out and it didn't have a kitchen and it didn't have a bathroom, then there'd be some issues around you actually operating a rental unit that was substandard for rental, okay? So that would end also pretty quickly. So we generally intervene around RVs when we get a neighbor complaint. And the ones that we've usually dealt with go to the question of noise or proximity to the property, the neighboring property, and can be resolved sometimes, but typically it results in the RV moving on. With accessory dwelling units, there's some important other provisions here that are specific to Brattleboro. We don't, I should back it up and say with RVs, we don't have a time limit on RVs. Some communities in Vermont say things like, You can have an RV on your property that's occupied for up to 30 days, and then after that, it has to go. You heard from MJ before that in Massachusetts, it's 2 weeks. I guess you wear out your friendships faster there. Other communities, there's even tighter provisions than that. But for the most part, it's 30 days in Vermont, and we haven't put a number on it, and it hasn't come up as an issue. If it's an accessory dwelling unit, there are some limits that are not really that big of a deal for you guys if you're interested in things tiny. It can't be 900 square feet or more than 30% of the habitable floor area of the primary dwelling, whichever is the greater of those two. So that's not a big deal for tiny houses. 30%. You have to comply with parking standards. So you may be in a neighborhood that means that you are required to provide an off-street parking space for the accessory dwelling unit. You have to comply with setback requirements, both side and front and rear. Typically in the more compact urban neighborhoods, that's not a particularly big distance. It's either 5 or 10 feet from the sides and similar distance from the rear. And then here's a complicated one, but important to understand. You can have an accessory dwelling unit, but the property owner has to either reside in the primary unit, the primary dwelling unit on the property, or the accessory dwelling unit. So we've done it this way for a couple of different reasons. So imagine that you have been living happily in Brattleboro and you're finding it really hard to pay your property taxes and keep up the house, but you don't want to leave the neighborhood and you certainly don't want to leave Brattleboro. So you decide that because you're aging out and you want to have all your living and sleeping on one floor, you build an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, and you've got enough space, it works. For dimensional standards, it's all fine. So you have a nice little apartment or cottage built in the backyard, all single floor, so that you can get in and out of the bathroom and so forth easily. Either you're going to live there and then rent out the property in the front for income, or you're going to continue living in the property in the front and rent out the cottage in the back. You can't decide that this is your moment to skip to Florida and then rent both of them out. There's a reason for this. As I said in the earlier discussion, we have a lot of rental properties in Brattleboro, and we have a lot of amateur landlords, and we have a lot of professional landlords, and they run the spectrum from really solid citizens to slightly dodgy. What we're dealing with here is, if you're going to build an accessory dwelling unit, then either you're going to live in it, or you're going to live in the house that's the accessory dwelling unit is attached to, associated with. And that's because we want really tight control over what's going on in both structures. And so that's the easiest way to do it. We don't want to get into a situation where somebody with a sort of a developer mentality or a landlord mentality moves into a house, builds an accessory dwelling unit, and then rents both these units out, and then goes on and does it again and again and again, building up an empire of rental units and not being very interested in the quality or conditions of the rental units that they're operating. So that's the easiest explanation.
What about the storage?
You see the RV example. I'm not sure what you actually mean by your question. So,
Well, I mean,
somebody
here for 6 months.
Yep.
Florida for 6 months. Can they rent?
No. Right. It's straight up. Yeah. It's like somebody who owns one of the properties has to be present. Or somebody who owns the properties has to be present year round. Yeah. We would have a hard time finding that out, but if we did find out, that would be really problematic. So we would withdraw the permit.
I'm sorry, I'm just a little confused. So, if someone has let's say a tiny home, and they're living in it, renting out their house, and then they leave, but for like snowbird, but they don't rent out their tiny home to somebody else.
You can vacate it. You can leave it empty. Right. But I think the example was, so let me just get everyone clued in. So I've moved into my new accessory dwelling unit in the backyard. I've rented out my old home in the front, and then I decide that I'm going to go to Florida for 6 months. And then to cover the cost of going to Florida, I rent out my accessory dwelling unit. Can't do that, okay? If I just go to Florida and leave the door locked and the accessory dwelling unit is empty, then that's one thing. But putting another tenant in there, that's another, yeah. Okay, is that good? All right. So basically, boiling that down is if you've got an accessory dwelling unit, you have to be, as the owner, you have to be resident on the parcel, okay? The next question would be, can I subdivide land and build a tiny house? Yes, you can. Straight up, that would be fine. So imagine you find yourself with a nice 5 acres and a child or a relative would like to have a tiny house experience, and you've got enough land for them to put their tiny house on a separate piece of land, and for reasons to do with finances or something, you agree to sell them the land. As long as you can meet the dimensional standards of the minimum parcel size, you're good to go. Yes? Yes, there are frontage requirements and area requirements that are specific to each zoning district. So the more rural the zoning district, the bigger the minimum parcel size and the bigger the frontage. Frontage requirements are not very strict. Yes? No. No, it could be any. You can subdivide and then sell off the parcel for a tiny house to anybody. Yes.
How do you find out the different level requirements for different areas in the county?
Well, first of all, it's Vermont, and so the county is practically invisible. And so in Brattleboro, you'd look at this. And so these are land use regulations. They're available online as a downloadable PDF, and it's fully searchable. So that's where you would start. And so inside here, each district is described. There are maps, and there are dimensional standards and requirements that you just work your way through it. And then you call or email us, and we explain it. So, yeah. Yes, in the back.
Sounds like I'm come here to say if you buy a piece of land that's buildable, put a tiny house on it, as long as you're meeting all the setbacks and all that. That tiny house can't be on a trailer, can't be on wheels, right?
You could park an RV on a parcel. I mean, it would be an odd thing to do in some ways, but yes, you could do that. It's considered an RV, right. We don't actually have standards right now in the Brattleboro land use regulations covering the tethering or tying down of tiny houses or those structures. It's something that we're actually going to look at if this really takes off. I think that's solved. There is a risk. There's a definite risk that if you've got something like a tiny house, depending on its weight, and you don't tether it, that it could tip over in a wind event. And so, just like a mobile home. So, we are concerned about the possibility of that, but we don't actually have standards right now that would govern that. So, and then the only other issue here is insulating a tiny house that's still got the wheels and axles on is tricky because of the wind underneath the trailer part. And so, as a long-term proposition, it becomes a lot harder to put up with a tiny house that's really meant for the road in weather, in winter here. And that's the last part. So wheeled things are meant to be wheeled around. So often with a mobile home, people take the wheels and axles off and throw them underneath the mobile home and they never go back on. And they take them off because then they get easier access to underneath the mobile home to do plumbing and a whole bunch of other things that need to happen. And they don't really have any intention of moving it. If you were to use a tiny house as an RV and then park it on a lot and just leave it, sooner or later the tires are going to disintegrate, the wheel bearings are going to seize up, the axles are going to rust. All that stuff happens. And so you can't really, it's not a long-term proposition. You have to engage in pretty intensive seasonal maintenance, and we would insist that if you had an RV as a tiny house on a piece of land, that it be road registered and insured and roadworthy, which means at least once a year you're going to have to make it to the inspection station to get it inspected. So, that's what, in the end, that's where people just drift off, and that's when it becomes a problem. Yes.
So you were saying with an accessory dwelling unit that somebody could subdivide a lot and sell it off with a tiny house on it. But then if we have a primary dwelling unit, it's fixed rate, and we just have an accessory dwelling unit on it.
We don't have any minimum house. We don't have a minimum footprint for a house. So if you wanted to treat your RV tiny house as a house, we don't have any reason to prevent you from doing that, except from a lifestyle point of view, it's got limitations. So
No, I meant an accessory dwelling unit for a house.
the accessory dwelling unit requirement only pertains to when you've got an existing structure and you're not subdividing. If you subdivide and all you put on it is a tiny house as an RV, that's possible, right?
Even if it's not on wheels at that point.
Yeah. Then would have to meet some other requirements about the way it was done, but yes. Yep. John, is an accessory dwelling unit used as part of the density calculations for a parcel? And the answer is yes. And so let me try and explain why. Brattleboro's land use regulations have density calculations. We have maximum coverage restrictions on residential uses, and we have minimum density requirements. So what we would be measuring there is whether in some circumstances you could have a parcel, an existing residential parcel and an existing home, and an accessory dwelling unit might have to be reduced in size or sized carefully because you're going to trigger a density limit on the parcel. In other words, too much building on the parcel. That's a good question. If it's your parcel and your tiny house, you have to have the hookup to the town water and sewer. It may pass through somebody else's property, but you can't hook up to somebody else's system.
If they own the tiny house?
If they own the tiny house, then they're going to hook it to they're probably going to hook it to their existing setup. And so that's allowable, but that's a public works question, and there are actually pretty steep fees for that, so, yep.
Price of that,
Right.
and so
So let me just hold you there so that people know what the question is. So the question here is, how do you go about obtaining insurance for a non-RV based, so a permanent and stationary tiny house, and you're trying to locate it in Brattleboro? Or, okay.
are you only talking Brattleboro?
Yeah. I think that your question is actually a good one. It's outside the scope of what I want to talk about, but it's a really good heads up for people that typically what I'd say is, as a town regulator, we're ornery and a little tricky to deal with, and you have to really know what you're dealing about, but we're kittens compared to the bank and the insurance company, okay? So if you're going to go down this road, the thing I would actually start with first is getting your financing thing sorted out and the banking stuff really clear, and then the insurance stuff is actually very, very tricky. So that's, if I was going to do a project like this, I'd almost start there and then come see someone like me about the zoning things. We don't obviously deal with that stuff, but we see people grappling with that quite a bit. So let me just try and get this clear. So your problem is that you don't know how to classify the structure, and you don't know then whether it's going to meet the requirements of the place that you want to locate it from a zoning standpoint. Is that correct?
Yeah, because they won't actually give you a yes or no until it actually lands on the foundation, and that's when the inspector and that's when the insurer comes out. So I've had it inspected off-site.
Right.
With a building inspector, and I've had it insured. I talked to insurance for 4 hours, really explaining what's going on and being really in detail, but they're still like, sorry, we can't tell you. So it's really hard to make that leap,
Right.
$50,000 leap, when you don't even know
Right.
if you'll have it.
Right, so you have to do something on faith before they tell you whether they're actually going to insure it or not. Yeah, right. That's exactly the kind of Yeah, and it is a really big issue. And it's just that problem of it being relatively new and it just doesn't fit into any of their existing categories, so they just don't know how to deal with it. Yeah. So hang on a second. I'm going to take 2 more questions really quickly. Here.
Regarding the septic, I'm assuming, how do the regs work as far as you've got a house, you build an accessory dwelling unit in an area, in a septic situation? How do you, is that a state issue as far as how many
Yes.
toilets? Is it
Yes.
by how many toilets?
So Vermont is a little odd. When you get a septic permit, yeah, no, sorry. When you get a septic permit in Vermont, they base it on the number for a residential structure. They base it on the number of bedrooms. So you can have a 2-bedroom septic system. You can have a 3-bedroom septic system. You can have a 5-bedroom septic system. They obviously get bigger the number of bedrooms that you're catering to. So the design gets more expensive, as does the cost. So if you've got, say you've got a 3-bedroom house, existing house, somewhere in the rural residential section of Brattleboro, and you're on 10 acres, so you've got plenty of room for a tiny house, but your septic system is only designed for the 3-bedroom house that you've got, and then you put a tiny house on it, you're going to have to go back and have your septic system modified and your permit amended so that you would count the tiny house as maybe 1 bedroom. So then you're going to have a 4-bedroom system. And if you didn't do that, you may not get into trouble in the early days, but you would pretty soon, because we would review that permit as the property gets appraised. So when the town appraisal staff come and visit your site and discover there's a tiny house in the backyard and it's hooked up to the septic, then we'd want to see evidence that the permit was modified for that. So that's Vermont specific, and I think Massachusetts would be tougher. One more question, Nishana, really quick.
I've seen situations where a tiny house is created for a child and it's using a composting toilet and maybe a hot plate, right?
Yep.
So does that qualify it as an accessory dwelling unit because it has, or not? Because is that really a kitchen? Is that really a bathroom? Or is that, how do they do it?
You're in a gray area on the kitchen question, and the composting toilet is kind of, we would count that as a dwelling unit, but we'd need to see evidence of the composting toilet design, I guess. The hot plate thing, plenty of people come up with these kinds of solutions, and it's okay if it's in family and it's okay for a little while. We are always a little uncomfortable about it, to be really honest. It's either, it either does it or it doesn't do it. If it doesn't do it, then we're going to be really clear that it's not a dwelling unit. What we'd say in an instance like that is that if it was part of a rental relationship, even if it could be in a family and a rental agreement. So say the tenant ends up in a difficult situation, they can't access the house for a bathroom or something because there's a dispute, then that's the worst case scenario, and that's what we're trying to look to avoid. So we would use the permitting tools that we have available to try and avoid that by saying, this doesn't qualify as a dwelling unit, so you can't be here and rent from your uncle or aunt or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
There's no rent involved because it's a child.
Yeah, it's still kind of icky, but yeah, and we just deal with it. That's what we do. Lots of amateur mediation. Why don't you want them to have Cheerios? That kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much, everybody.